Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to us today to join us for our webcast. Glad to have everybody. My name is Dina Evans, and I am the Senior Manager of Global Events here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited about today's presentation. Today we'll be covering, the topic will be Fortify Your Security Posture. And our presenters for today's webcast, we have Charles Araujo from Intellyx. He's a principal analyst. And we also have Doug Dangremond. He's the SVP of Threat Intelligence Services here at LookingGlass Cyber. Just a couple quick housekeeping notes before we begin regarding the BrightTalk platform. Please make sure that you know that on your screen there's a chat feature where you should feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters. We'll be addressing all of the questions at the very end of the presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time and can't go through all the submitted questions, we'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation. So don't be shy. Go ahead and submit your questions. Also, please note that any questions that are submitted through the chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments, and we'll contact you directly if that's what you desire. Also note that there is some attachments section. We have a few links that you can download at your convenience regarding today's topic. But other than that, everything's pretty self-explanatory, and we're glad to have you. So without any further delay, this time I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to our presenters to kick off today's webcast. And our first one, we have Charles. So I'm going to go ahead and move it over to Charles' first slide. And
Dina,
take it away.
thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody and, of course, with the LookingGlass team and talking about I think a very important topic, something that frankly, I don't know that we're talking about enough right now, and that is the true nature of, what does it even mean to have a security posture? So before we get into that, let me just a little bit about me, mostly to set some context and to set expectations properly. As Dina mentioned, I'm the principal analyst with an industry analyst firm called Intellyx, and we're an analyst firm that focuses on what we call agile digital transformation. And so what you can get from that is that I'm not necessarily what you might call a traditional security expert. What we focus on is really the changing dynamic that is occurring within IT and understanding how that fits into the totality of everything that's going on, how organizations must be adapting towards it. And that's really going to be the context of my talk today, because security is a critical part of that equation. I'm also the founder of an organization called the Institute for Digital Transformation. I'm the author of a couple books, one called The Quantum Age of IT, Why Everything You Know About IT is About to Change. The other is called Ecosystem Advantage, and my third book is about to be published. It's all about performance-driven IT. And so you can kind of get that sense. But I think that the understanding how security fits into this bigger picture is critical. And I'm sure most of you are probably practitioners. And so understanding how we're putting all of these pieces together, I think, is one of the more important aspects that we have to deal with, because the nature of security, at least from my perspective, is changing dramatically within the enterprise. I mean, it used to be that it was all about moats and walls. And frankly, for most of our history, the security approach, while complex from a technical perspective, was fairly straightforward. But today we're dealing with, I think, a much more challenging environment, and that the threat profiles are evolving rapidly. I mean, I guess there's good news to this, right? To a large extent, the enterprise has won, to a certain extent, the perimeter battle, right? I mean, a full frontal assault on a perimeter, on an enterprise's security perimeter, I know it still happens and still going there, and there's always the chance that, we've got a patch that didn't get applied or whatever, but for the most part, that's a fool's errand, right? Attacking the full frontal assault is just not the way. I mean, I always laugh at the movies when they show the hackers going in, because we all know that isn't really what security is looking like today, right? The true evolution of this is that it's coming from all directions, and we have to be addressing this much more holistically because it is, it is really the evolution of phishing and the social engineering that is now kind of the challenge. And so as we are looking at this entire totality, the security posture becomes much, much more complex. But there's another side to this, and that is that, I often will tease that you guys, meaning security professionals, have one of the most difficult jobs in the business of IT or within the enterprise, because it's almost all downside and no upside. And what I mean by that is that when things go wrong, when there is a breach, when there is an issue, there's plenty of blame to go around, and everyone is looking like, how could you let this happen? But there's very little upside of this recognition of how much work is really going into this. And the reality is that this is only getting more complex, and the stakes are only getting bigger, because it's not as easy as simply saying, well, we're going to secure everything. Because, the joke is that it's easy to be entirely secure. Just don't connect with anybody and don't let anything happen. But that doesn't actually serve the business goals, because from a business perspective, we need more interaction, not less, more connections, not fewer. We need the ability to interact more dynamically across a broader spectrum of those interactions than ever before. And in fact, it is the need for organizational agility, that ability to adapt and move rapidly in the marketplace, that is what drives competitive advantage. And so the trick with security is to find that balance point where you're secure enough that we don't end up in the headlines, but not so that the security posture, the apparatus, is not actually limiting the organization's ability to respond from a market perspective. And so that means that really security needs to be viewed much more holistically from the entire, from an entire perspective of where the potential impact is. And so that's why things like, looking at the kill chain is effective, because it helps understand the different aspects of this, but it also can be limiting, because we have to make sure that we're understanding this from that holistic perspective, and we're looking at it not only from the actual the mechanics of the attack, but planning for things like remediation, but assuming that there's going to be a breach, and then how do you respond most rapidly and most effectively after that. And then on the other side of that coin, how do you deal with identifying threats before they actually even occur and before they've impacted you? And that's really this idea of threat intelligence, and really where we're going to spend the rest of our time talking a little bit today. I think that threat intelligence is one of the most important and emerging areas when it comes to the security posture of enterprise organizations, because it effectively is the ability of taking the fight outside your own walls, so to speak. I love this slide, and I actually think you should, all go use it. It's a free license you can find on the internet, and use it, because I think it speaks perfectly for what the reality that's going on. Is that most people, certainly your board and your business executives, have no idea of the constant onslaught of an attack that is happening within any enterprise organization today. They don't see it, they don't know it, they don't understand it, and frankly, I think most people, even in IT, don't really comprehend the severity of the situation today. And so, this is this very visceral example or depiction, I guess, of what's really happening, is that it's this constant bombardment, and you guys are living it every single day, and it's difficult because nobody really gets it, right? And so the only real solution is to get in front of it, to start dealing with these attacks before they've occurred, to get them when they're still in this idea of threats. And then, of course, the other reason I really like it is because, every security professional wears a hoodie and a backpack and rides their bike to work, right? So, but I think as we start thinking in these terms of what does it mean to deal with threat intelligence, is that it really starts changing the dynamic. I mean, the reason that we don't actually deal with this a whole lot in most organizations is because it's beyond our walls, it's beyond our control, right? When we're dealing with it from the perimeter inward, it's stuff that we can get our head around. It's stuff that it's data that we own. It's the part of this that we can control. But when we talk about threat intelligence, that's a whole lot harder. It's because it's stuff that's happening out there, right? And there's a paradigm or a model that we can look at here, and that's the intelligence agencies, all those three-letter acronym organizations out there, for the government and what have you. And this is what they do. And if we think about it, that makes this job, well, I guess it can make it very cool, but it also makes it very, very challenging, because what are they dealing with? They're dealing with sorting through all of the noise, they call it chatter, right? All of the stuff that's going on, and trying to identify which of that is real, which of it actually means something and represents a threat, and which of it is just that, it's just noise. And now suddenly, I think that each and every one of you are in that same boat. You need to start thinking and acting in many ways along these same lines, because you have to be going through and sorting through all that noise and chatter that's out there and find out which of it actually represents a potential threat to you. And I think this is actually the reason that, this whole idea of threat intelligence, it's starting to pick up steam, because people are recognizing that they've got to do that, they've got to get ahead of it. But it's also not, or it's also, I think that there's a delay in how people are responding to this, and they're not jumping in because it's hard. There's a reason these intelligence agencies have these massive budgets and this massive apparatus to do this, because finding these threats in the sea of threats is incredibly difficult. And the key to making it work, the way that you actually do that, there's obviously from a technical perspective a bunch of different elements, but the key is context. And I think this is often missed, right? That it's this idea that it's all about the technical aspects of it. And clearly the technical aspects are critical and important. But the real key to identifying the threats that are meaningful to you are understanding them in the context of your business and what's important to your business. And so that's why these attempts to look at them from a purely abstracted basis don't actually work, because it's impossible to simply look at it from a raw technical perspective and be able to understand the severity of that threat. And if, again, going back to an intelligence agency and how they look at it, they're doing the exact same thing, right? They are applying context to understand. And that context is obviously from the perspective of the specific, whoever they're protecting, right, of understanding, what are they using the right words and terms, but it's also contextual from the standpoint of point in time, right? Where are they going? Is there a relationship between the chatter they're hearing and a trip that's planned, et cetera, right? So the context is not only in a static sense, but it is in a visceral sense of understanding the fluid nature of the target and how they therefore can assess those threats. And so that context becomes critical. And here's the trick, that in order for that context to be relevant, in order for it to actually to be real, then you have to move beyond viewing this as a purely technical issue, and you have to integrate security into the operational fabric of the organization itself. Now, on the one hand, this is something we've been talking about, or certainly is something we've said for a very long time, right? But I think to a certain extent, and maybe this is a little bit of tough love, is that we haven't always actually believed it. Meaning that it's one thing to say that security needs to be everyone's job, and I'm a big believer doing the whole marketing campaigns of if you see something, say something, kind of that version of it for the corporate environment, and doing all the security awareness training. I'm a believer of all that. But I think that there's been this kind of cultural thing where it's like, security, this is too complex for the average person to understand, and so we're going to have to, it's going to be what we do. And I think that's there's obviously a lot of validity to that. But it is about finally kind of transcending that and saying that security needs to be about more than just the security team and the security apparatus. It needs to be integrated and woven into the very fabric of way things operate. I'm on record as saying that I believe in the relatively near future, we're going to see security stop being an independent group and being merged much more closely into operations, certainly IT operations, and probably even more broadly than that, not because it doesn't remain a very critical skill and a critical discipline, but because the siloed mentality that continues to exist becomes the weak link in the chain. And so we have to create this integrated approach where security is simply, an aspect in which we are always looking at everything that's happening. The other major part, I think, about this when we talk about the integration of security into the operational fabric is that it needs to be, in order to create this contextual awareness, we have to be looking at it holistically and organically. And what I mean by that is that we need to create that situational awareness. So it's not just about seeing it from a technical perspective, but it's about understanding. So for instance, if there's a new product being rolled out and it's in stealth, is the security team being made aware of it? Are you looking at those so that when you're looking from a threat perspective, you can understand if somebody is aware of this, right? Understanding that if there's new offices being opened, right? Are we building that into the awareness context so that when we're looking at our security threats, that we are looking at it from the context of what's important to the business? So this idea of weaving it in and having it much more integrated, it's not about, quote unquote, the rest of the business doing the job of security, but it's about recognizing that all of that context is critical. And the hard part about this is nobody is going to know what's actually important until it is. And so it's about weaving all of that in and taking that much more holistic view. And what that really comes down to is this idea that we have to get past this this idea that security is somehow the job of the security team, right? And you have to shift your focus and your view of how you look at all of this. And part of that is when building the security village. Again, if we go back to the security or the intelligence community, right? So think about how they're structured. They've got their internal analysts who are doing exactly probably the thing that you're doing, but they have more than that. They also form partnerships and relationships with other intelligence organizations around the world. They cultivate, independent field agents that are out there and collecting information. They cultivate a network of informants. They're doing all of these different things to effectively build an apparatus that extends far beyond the specific domain that they control and manage. They have to build this village because when we talk about transforming your security posture, you just are going to have to recognize and accept the fact that it's just a different world. And in order for you to do the best job that you can for your organization to find and strike that right balance, that you are going to have to pull all these pieces together and be able to deal with more than just what you can actually control, but about being able to get in front of this, assess it from a threat perspective, but that's going to take a whole lot more than just probably the resources you have available to you right now. Right? And so the question is, how do you actually do this? And I think there's three major steps or pieces of this, I guess. The first is that you have to focus on adapting your culture. I mean, a lot of what I've talked about, and it's probably no surprise given my background and kind of how I see the world, but it's about fundamentally, first and foremost, shifting how you see your role and the job you're doing within the organization. You need to get beyond kind of the point of feeling like this is, quote unquote, all on you, and recognizing that a huge part of your job is to be building and maintaining this apparatus. And part of that is then working with the broader organization to ensure that the proper context is delivered so that you can do your job. And so I think the adaptation of the culture is critical. But clearly, that's not enough. We also need to be looking and taking advantage of every single intelligent tool that's out there. I covered RSA this year, and it was staggering and overwhelming and also incredibly necessary. As we looked across the platform, there are tools all over, and there's a rationalization process here, but the important part here is looking at those tools that bring a degree of intelligence, because the one thing I haven't really talked about yet here, but that is that security, just like operations, is increasingly going to become a business of data. And the more data you have, the better that data is, and the more rapidly you can adjudicate it, find the patterns, and identify anomalous behavior, the better off you're going to be. And so looking at those tools that help you do that and effectively augment your own internal capabilities. And I don't mean that, I mean that in both in terms of expansiveness, but also in terms of the actual capability, meaning as humans, we just can't process the data fast enough to identify the patterns that represent threats. And so being able to leverage tools to help us do that is critical. And then the third part is the other form of augmentation, and that is how do you build the rest of that apparatus, just like I was talking about the intelligence agencies do. How do you augment things, your security posture, through the use of partners, through people that have specialized expertise that can help you extend your security apparatus in ways that you need to, that either you don't have the capabilities or just don't make sense for you to be doing. And so I think those are the three major areas that you're looking at. If there's one challenge I think that a lot of security organizations have is that when they're looking at with their forward-looking security strategy, they're looking at it from a very technical perspective, and that's important. But I think you also need to be looking at it from an organizational and operational perspective and addressing the things like, what does your culture need to look like? What are the relationships going to be between and throughout the organization to make this work, to get the context you need? What is your tool strategy that's going to support that and allow you to identify those threats, to build that intelligence throughout the entire spectrum from threat intelligence to remediation? And then who's the rest of your team outside of your organization that's going to give you the capacity that you need and the capabilities you need to actually respond to this? The last thing I want to leave you with, however, with all of that said, is to remember one last thing, and that is that security is one piece of an incredibly complex puzzle that we are dealing with right now. So our whole focus is on what we call agile digital transformation, and fundamentally what we believe is that there's a massive transformation or transition that is happening within the world right now, in which we are exiting the industrial age, entering this new era, whatever you want to call it. But as part of that, the fundamental ways that organizations are structured, managed, and led are in fact changing, transformed by technology, but it's really about this business transformation. And there's a very, very good chance that your organization is in the midst of this right now in ways that you may or may not always see. And so security is one part, a critical part, but one part of that puzzle. And so as you're doing all of this, everything we were just talking about, you have to make sure that you maintain the perspective of understanding how it fits into this bigger picture. And the good news is security is going to become more critical and more important, not less, more relevant, not less. The good news, bad news of some of these recent breaches is that the executive team is starting to really recognize that they better at least get a handle on this to a certain extent, because their jobs are potentially on the line too with it. But it's about putting this in this bigger context, and the more you do that, the more traction you get politically, from a funding perspective certainly, and put all the pieces together. So with that, I know we're going to turn this over to Doug, who's going to go into a lot more detail specifically about what this looks like, and how do you actually turn some of this into reality and deal with threats on a more pragmatic basis. And we'll go from there, and then I guess we'll both stick around for questions afterwards. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Doug.
Thanks, Charles. Great stuff and very interesting. I think when you cover a lot of this, obviously it raises a lot of questions, and one of the things that I do believe you're spot on about is that it is a very important piece. The threat intelligence side of it is still difficult to value for some corporations, and in some ways, a lot of ways, it's an evolving trade craft as well. So the combination of those two things makes it challenging, but threat intelligence as a whole is extremely valued to organizations, and I think everyone's starting to realize it, as is evidenced by the topic that we're talking about today. So talking about threat intelligence as a service, I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail, but I thought it might be at least helpful for those of you who may not be familiar with, who LookingGlass is as a company, just so that you have a little bit of background on what we're doing. So just as a 360-degree view, today we have a product capability, threat intelligence platform, if you will, that manages intelligence, our intelligence, but also other intelligence providers, We have a customized workflow in that platform, and it allows for a single pane of visibility that enables you to manage all the different types of threat intelligence coming in and turn that into actionable events. So that's important because I'm actually using some of our own technologies in the delivery of threat intelligence as a service to some of our customers, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. The other thing that we have is we have appliances. It's probably not a really eloquent way to define it, but we have the ability to do threat mitigation within the network through some technologies that we're deploying. And it's turnkey, off-the-shelf tools to protect the assets. We can do it in an automated mitigation way, stopping things like DNS attacks, phishing, malware, malicious C2s, and more. But we do that either in conjunction with our threat intelligence platform, or in some cases we actually have a product called Scout Shield that we can put into the network and take some of our MRTI and directly feed it in. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea on the network side, some of the products we do, but more importantly, what we do today in the services side and what we're really talking about today is our capability to deliver threat intelligence. And I put that into a category called data, and data to me is a lot of threat intelligence that isn't really defined yet purposely for a customer. In my mind, it becomes threat intelligence when we actually are applying it to the customer individually. But some of the capabilities that we do have there is we do look at full spectrum threats. And I think this is really important because threat intelligence isn't just about the network. It could be things like social media monitoring, phishing, physical brand protection. All of those things start to come in as a full threat intelligence offering that you need to consider. And as you look at a provider potentially to do this, you need to look at their capability to do all of those things at once because they're all related and they're going to continue to combine in terms of the way that they're affecting your organization. The second area of that is that, when you say 99% historical accuracy, what that really is saying is that it's highly curated data. It's very focused on customers and giving them minimal false positives. And one of the things that people don't realize about LookingGlass is, although we've been around for 8 years as a brand, they did through acquisitions a company that I came from that was doing open source threat intelligence collection for 20 years. So we do bring an experience level to this that's been learned over a very long period of time. And then lastly, a broadest coverage of threat types. It's really important when you're looking at providers, both globally. What I mean by that is, global events, geographical information about context, as Charles said, context is king. So not everything is always targeted exactly at your assets or your company. It may be things that are going around in your industry or are happening around the world that you need to know about because eventually that may be laterally moving towards you. And so those are some of the things that we do there. And even then, in the industry space, we know that TTPs from certain threat actors and other things behaviorally are occurring in an industry that may not be occurring in a different one. You need to know what those are. And so we provide all that. But I don't do it with technology alone. I also have an analyst support. We operate today a 7x24 fully staffed analyst team that is monitoring all of the open source and collecting and notifying that to customers in real time. So we're doing monitoring, alerting, incident management, research analysis, and investigations across all of threat intelligence. And that's a real important point too as you're looking at other providers who are going to augment your own capabilities. You want to make sure that you understand where their expertise is and what the full breadth or scope of capabilities they have. So I'll kind of move past that, and I hope you appreciate and sorry for giving you a little bit of a commercial, but I thought it was important to at least understand where we're coming from. So with that, I wanted to take a second and talk about, well, what is threat intelligence as a service to make sure that we're at least on the same sort of baseline as we talk about some of the concepts. We can all debate what threat intelligence is. There's a lot of different definitions, and I'm not going to read these, but you can see, I took excerpts from the CIA, from the FBI, and even Gartner. And Gartner's is very verbose in some ways, but there's some common elements in there, such as knowledge, foreknowledge, understanding things that you need to do to make more informed decisions. And then combining that sort of potpourri of different definitions with, as a service, what are we looking at? Well, in threat intelligence, we really don't have that as a defined market right now. It's not out there in a common way, but there are other services that are out there in a similar manner. Software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and there are some commonalities in those as well. And so when you really do combine these, what you're getting into is a definition of intelligence that has a few components. Identifying knowledge and foreknowledge of the world around us that includes existing or emerging threats to assets. And I think Charles said, being able to be predictive or lean forward is a very valuable thing that we're all striving to get to. It's not easy to do, however. And it includes context, indicators, implications, and various threats in order to do that properly. And probably the most important part of intelligence is to be able to provide information that's been analyzed and refined so that it's useful to policymakers in making decisions. Whether that's operational or planning, you have to take that threat intelligence and figure out a way to make it actionable with a decision. Otherwise, it's not valuable, and it's not really going to bring a value to the organization that you're supporting. And then all of this, when we talk about as a service, is really changing it from building within your own walls to being able to have someone else own and host some of this capability and offer it back to you on an on-demand basis when and where you need it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that concept, but from the standpoint of what did we build? So over the last, although I said we've been doing this for 20 years, in the last 5 years we've really focused on how to operationally make this efficient. We've had a lot of analysts doing this work for years, but what we needed was more of a collection and tagging and a technology effort that was going to make it efficient, especially as we saw a massive increase in the volume of information and the sort of footprint that we had to go collect from and cover. So just to give you an idea, collection and tagging capability, it is all about the technology in this space. I think many times organizations, whether they go and outsource it, they buy a tool or something else that they think is going to solve that problem, and they find it's woefully inadequate to be able to do all the things they need. Or they try to build it in-house, and they're really overwhelmed by the amount of complexity and cost that's involved in doing that. So to give you an idea of that, I just wanted to share with you some of the data points from my own team's collection and tagging capability with our technologies. So today, I have 90 physical servers, actually more than 90 physical servers, supporting my infrastructure to do this, with over 400 virtual machines delivering on this, 90 plus back-end applications with over 73 different applications and tool sets that are being used by the teams. And so when you think about those things, not only do I have to have that capability, not only do I have to maintain that, but I have to have scripters and developers who are constantly improving those tools to make them efficient, especially in an evolving environment. And then to tie that off, that requires me to have over 175 terabits of storage, and that is growing rapidly, by the way, and I have to have at least 4 different ISPs serving my needs. So when you put that type of profile together and you talk about, gee, I want to go out and be a collection and tagging organization, I want to do it in-house, you need to understand the scale and scope of what you're going to have to build. You need to understand how long it will take you to build this, and then maintaining it from a cost and a people perspective. And really, I would encourage you to do that as an exercise to make sure, if you embark down this road, that your senior management understands what you're signing up for. The alternative, as we'll get into, is using someone else's as a service type approach, which is something that we are adopting and looking at doing for customers in many ways. The other thing to consider when you're looking this, and by the way, the reason why these things are really important is because when you're looking at these things, this may be a decision that you're going to build or buy, but even if you decide to buy, these are the areas that you should be looking at companies who do this and understanding whether that they're truly capable to deliver what you need. So as I go through this, I'm not only going to talk about that, but I'm also going to try to give you some points to think about if you decide you want to try to build. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of C-level view of all of this as well. And so having talked about the technologies, I think that you still have to think about people. Evolving the role of the analyst in this, and I say it's an evolving role because if you go back about 5 years ago, I think a lot of analysts were involved heavily in doing collection and doing the investigations on incidents individually, but we saw that there was a requirement to build more discipline into that, to be able to have analysts who were focused on different discrete tasks so that they could become experts in and of themselves in those areas. And I talk about that from the real-time operators who are dealing with making changes to networks or dealing with threats that are coming in at a rapid pace and having to deal with those in real time. We see now that all of a sudden investigations is a skill set in and of itself that you have to decide. Do you want your people to do investigations? Do you want to outsource that? If you're going to bring it in-house, what are you going to have them investigate and focus on? Are they going to go outside their walls to determine those threats and look at those instances, or are they going to look inside? Because as we know, there's a lot of insider threat that's occurring that is now being able to be identified through some sort of behavioral analytics or other tools. But even that, once it occurs, still requires an analyst to look at that behavioral analytics and say, what's happening here? And so when you start to think about lateral movement, and you use the term now in the marketplace called cyber hunters, the question is, what are you going to define a cyber hunter as? Are they going to hunt within your own walls? Are they going to go externally? Or are they going to try to do both? And think about the resources required when you start to go down that path. And then lastly, planning. And this is probably, in my observations, and even in our own organization, a very challenging space, because the unplanned events are what always overtake your time and your efforts. And if you don't really carve out some specific people and resources to do planning appropriately, you wake up and you find that everything starts to atrophy very quickly, and you have to have a plan and a vision on how you're going to continue to keep up with this and eventually evolve it and drive operational efficiencies through what you're doing. And then even once you get all that done, you've decided technology-wise whether you're going to go out or in, you decided what your roles of your team will be versus possibly a provider, you have to then turn around and look at, how am I going to operationalize this into actionable intelligence? So yes, the provider can give you intelligence, but then if you're not able to action it via some sort of technology, whether it's a people action or a mitigation action on your network, you have to be able to understand how that's going to be used. Otherwise, the money you're spending really isn't going to give you a return on investment. The other challenges in this are, by nature, open source threat intelligence is very unstructured. So you have to actually not only understand the threat, but you have to figure out a way to put it into a structured format that it's going to allow you to define policies that you can repeatedly implement and train people on what to do with. And that's not easy to do. I can tell you we have done this, but it was a great pain and a lot of years of experience to be able to do it properly. And then also, any provider, whether it's ourselves, which we're implementing, but also externally, if you're reviewing a company to decide to partner with, you have to look at standards-based approaches. Things like STIX and TAXI and those things are really important, not because today it's prevalent across everything, but you don't want to be locked into a proprietary approach. You want to have tools and technologies and processes that are able to leverage standards as they evolve and improve over time. And they always do. So that's a benefit of using that approach, but it's also can be very costly if you don't, to try to convert later. The next thing to think about is I talked about your people and the tools and technology and everything, but oftentimes deciding where you focus your resources and time, I actually use something called a test. And it's really about time, expertise, and staff and tools, and looking at each piece of the capabilities operationally and saying, do I have the time to do this? And the example I'd use is that you have threats coming at you today. And if you just came into a role, or you've just been decided by the organization that you're going to build out a threat intelligence capability, the reality is you're being bombarded every day. And I think Charles had a great slide where he had the skyline with the things coming and dropping in as I don't know if they were meteors or bombs or what they were, but it was a cool visual. The idea being that you might not have the time to build your own, because by the time you start to do that, if it's months, and it will be at least months, to start to build your own capability by hiring and deciding on technology, implementing it, and operationalizing it, you might actually be out of a job by then, because you may have an event that already causes a problem to the corporation, and if you're viewed as the person who's responsible for protecting it, they're not going to give you leeway while you build. So time does become a factor. It also becomes a factor with your own staff. Do you have enough time in the day to do all the things that you need to do? And if you don't, then you may need to look at other resources to help with that. Expertise. The challenge here is that the marketplace is starved for skill sets. And we need to look at the skill sets that you have in-house. You'll need to look at the skill sets of a provider and determine what you want to borrow from them, what you want to have in-house, but can you retain and protect those skill sets as you go forward? Because it's really difficult to do. And when they get more expert, they start to get interest from other companies and other places, and so you now have to retain those resources, and it may become more expensive to do that. We've already talked a lot about tools, but the staff, do you have enough people to complete all the tasks? So it's not even a question of do you have the time or the expertise, but do you literally have the bodies to do it? And when you get into the operational of managing day-to-day activities, that can become the consuming factor of all your staff. And if that happens, then how are you going to deal with all the other things you have to deal with? So I think this is a really important area, because what you're really trying to do is look at what I think Charles referenced was the security balance, being secure and being agile. This is a part of that process. How fast are you going to react? Who's going to react? What are the skill sets? What are the value points that you want to go after? And I'll use one really quick, simple example. United Airlines. I don't want to call them out, but when you're doing reputational protection and you're getting reputational commentary back, for an example, and all of a sudden someone gets dragged off a plane, probably the amount of volume you're going to see coming back as reputational hits is going to be extremely high. You may want to tone down that for a period of time or turn it off even, because you don't necessarily want to have that kind of volume coming in, because you can't deal with your staff. So being able to balance security with agility, understanding when threats are coming at you and why they're coming at you are really important. And all of these factors, your time, your expertise, your staff, and your tools are really important in that, evaluating that process and building a strategy. So once you've kind of done that, this clicker goes a little fast, but you get to the point of, we've talked about what it takes to create a capability, or if you decide you're not going to create it, what it would take to evaluate an external provider. Secondly, we've talked about resources and decisions, because I would tell you that no matter what, if you go outside for threat intelligence as a service, you probably want to have some skill sets in-house, and you need to decide what those skill sets are and where they're going to bring the most value. And then really the benefits of going outside in some ways, it brings you an accelerated operational capability. As I talked about earlier, if you can't protect today and you're going to build, you have a lag time to be able to do that. Going outside as a service provider could give you an accelerated operational capability that you just don't have today. Maybe you use it as an interim while you're building out your own practice, but having that capability can accelerate what your skills and your ability to protect are. Access to capabilities that augment or align to your goals. So, do you have enough resources? Do you have some ability to go outside for surge? If you think about investigations, they're very ad hoc or up and down type cycles when you've got some incidents occurring. Maybe you want to go outside and borrow some of those resources and bring them in temporarily. That's an excellent way to augment your skill sets. And you have to decide, again, visibility and value to the organization. You can align your goals with your people and then augment accordingly. And then lastly, you get great improved resource management. Retaining people, managing those resources. Ultimately, you want to have the best resources you can. That also will lead to a lower cost and more efficiency if you improve your resource management pool by using an outside provider as part of that strategy. And so those are a few things that I would say are benefits in looking at as a service type approach versus building it completely in-house or buying discrete things from customers in piecemeal, such as a service or a technology independently of other things. So the last part of that, I would say, is that whatever you decide, to do it in-house or to do it as a provider approach, you better be prepared for waves of change. And they will come in small waves and then sometimes very large waves because of things like regulation and compliance. It's always evolving. So, you may or may not be aware that New York is implementing some new rules around what companies are required to do for supply chain and third-party management. Those things are really important to understand, because if you're going to do business in New York, then you may have to comply with some of those things, and those are going to be intelligence and security-related issues. Support and funding will come and go. This is another thing that you need to be aware of. So as much as we say that is now top of mind to protect security is there, security will always be a little bit event-driven. So when an incident occurs, whether it's to your organization, hopefully it's not, or it's to another organization that's in a similar industry or in the same industry, you're going to have to realize that focus will come. And with that, sometimes resources and money come with it. But over time, the better you get, the quieter the landscape gets in terms of threats, support and money often wane. So you're going to be in an ebb and flow of that support and funding, and there are going to be short-term memories from a lot of C-levels when they forget about that pain they had many years ago. And so all of those things cause events to occur, focus and money comes up, and then as those things subside, it goes away a little bit. And unfortunately, security can be often looked at as a taxation to be avoided by executives. And so what I would tell you is it's not only good enough to have operational success, to be good at what you do, to have analysts who are efficient, to be operationally perfect, you have to continue to keep the security at top of mind. I think Charles mentioned it, integrating security into the operational or business. I think he used operational fabric. It's really important to not only do that because the businesses need to understand where the security risks are and how you're protecting against those, but more importantly, keeping it top of mind, even when things start to go well. People remember statistics, they remember data points and key performance indicators that you should put in place so that you're always top of mind on executives, that you're bringing value to the business by protecting the assets that are keeping them successful. And so I share that with you as we all know that, but it's really important to spend some time looking at how do you report up the food chain, the things that you're doing well, and the activities that you're actually doing so that you can tell the executives that not only are things going well, but here's the amount of effort and all of the people that are making sure that it stays that way. Because we all know that sooner or later an event is going to occur, and when you have that kind of data on a regular basis, it doesn't feel like you're trying to justify what you've been doing as the event occurs. It feels more like you've been doing the right things before the event and you'll continue to do the right things after, and that you've mitigated that event to the best possible outcome. And so I kind of ran through all that very quickly. Hopefully you found some value in looking at that from a provider's perspective in terms of how we built and how we manage our delivery, but also in a way to potentially evaluate if you're going to do it in-house or out-of-house. And with that, I guess I'll close out and just say thank you for taking your time to come and hear some of our discussions. And I think, Dina, we're going to open it up for any questions.
Yeah, we sure are. Doug, there's a few that have come through. So let me just start here at the first one that came in, and I'll let you guys hash it out and see who wants to address these. Let's see. The first one says, what should I be looking for when evaluating vendors who are going to provide us security as a service? Are there any red flags to be aware of?
So I'll start out, Charles, and then I'll hopefully if you have any thoughts on it. But I think that's a great question because that's kind of what I was walking through a little bit in terms of the piece parts that I think you should be comparing. So taking statements at face value isn't going to be a very good policy. You need to look underneath the hood at some of the pieces of that provider's capability. So looking at the technologies and asking hard questions. How do they know those data sets are coming in? How do they know that they're actually finding things? Because not always are you going to find something, but you need to know with confidence that they're actually able to collect and they're able to notify you of the collection activity, the sources, and all the things they're looking for. So I would make a real detailed analysis on the technology and how they're operationally doing things. And then the second part of that is they should have some level of combination of analyst skill sets and technology, because there are companies that are starting to approach it from a technology-only standpoint, and although there are concepts there that I think are very encouraging, and cost-wise that might be very attractive, but the reality of it is there's still a ton of sentiment and things that are not easily discerned through technology and analytics that humans are always going to be able to do better and more efficiently in some ways. And so I think you need to balance a combination of those two. So I would say very quickly that it's technology and making sure that it's robust and collecting across a wide spectrum, and then the analyst teams that are able to deliver on that in combination with the technology. And so, Charles, I jumped in there really quick. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, so first of all, I think you covered it here, and you covered it a little bit in your presentation as well. And I'm going to add, kind of the way I look at the world, it's always the 50,000-foot view. And I think those, we'll call those the functional specs are kind of the stuff you're talking about. I think those are critical. I always, I didn't actually say this in my presentation, but I was, right, an operations guy. I ran technical operations for about $1 billion healthcare company 20 years ago, and I spent most of my time advising IT executives in the 20 years since. And so, I very much have kind of an IT executive mindset with how I look at things. And one of the things that I always looked at whenever I was evaluating a partnership or a relationship was looking beyond the moment. And what I mean by that is it's great to be able to assess, who they are right now, what they can do for me right this second. But when I'm talking about a partnership, and I think when we're talking about threat intelligence or security as a service, it is absolutely, needs to be viewed through the prism of a partnership and a relationship, is that I need to, it's kind of like dating somebody, right? I mean, what is this going to look like a year from now, 5 years from now, right, from a relational standpoint? And so I'm really interested in is, are they adaptable? Are they agile? Are they, are they going to be agnostic and not so tied in? Because I think if you guys aren't familiar with this idea or the term of the innovator's dilemma, it was coined by Clayton Christensen, a professor out of Harvard, in a book like almost 20 years ago now. It's this idea that organizations get stuck, right? You get invested in, this is who we are, this is what we do, and therefore you can't innovate beyond that. And so, the security field is moving so fast that it's not only about adapting to emerging threat profiles, but also adapting to emerging technologies. And I think that when I'm evaluating it, I'd be looking at, is this an organization that shows through their history that they've been adaptable, that they haven't been, this is our hammer, so therefore everything looks like a nail, right? And taking that approach, because I think that says that this is then a partner that I can grow with and will be able to be there as things continue to evolve.
Yeah, Charles, I agree. And I think the one slide that I had in the presentation, the test analogy, right? Looking at time, the expertise, the staff, and the tools are the things that I would say are the piece parts that you definitely want to focus on.
Right.
Perfect. Thank you, gentlemen. Here's another one. This one's actually a very good question. How do I get all of the necessary stakeholders on board? IT ops, business ops, the C-suite, et cetera. That's a good one.
Charles, I'll let you go first since I did last time.
Okay. So I think that it is a good question, and I think that there's a couple of answers. The first is to recognize that you're not going to do it, get all of those different stakeholders on board with the same message, right? No different than almost like wearing a sales hat is you have to understand what's important to each of them. So the IT operations, what's important to them and their pain points, the things that they care about, are fundamentally different than what the business operations people or what the executive team are looking at. So you're going to have to understand and tune this message specifically to your audience. And by the way, not just generically, but specific to your organization. What's important to your IT operations team, et cetera. The other major thing I think, and this is endemic to security overall, I think, is that we tend to look at security. I have this term. I call it above the line, below the line value. And there's a well-known there's well-known neuroscience that says that as humans we are going to respond much more aggressively and immediately to a threat, right? To anything, to a fear-based motivator, right? And so that's why, to the point that Doug was talking about, that when there's an incident that happens in the public or within your organization, there's this immediate response. You're going to get funding. You're going to get attention. But the problem is it wanes, right? It's immediate. It's intense, and it's temporary. Over the long haul, we're much more driven to make lasting change when there's a positive outcome that we derive long-term benefit from. And so, think about exercise or diet, right? Your doctor will tell you that if you don't do this, you're going to, die of a heart attack or something, and that will have a short-term value, and it may spur that immediate response, but it's difficult to sustain that. And the reason is because it's a negative benefit that you never can see, right? I can't ever actually tell that I've avoided this heart attack, right? On the flip side is when you then tie it to a positive outcome. Oh, well, you're going to be able to, look better in your clothes, or you're going to, whatever that positive outcome might be, I can then attach myself to that and I can see my progress towards it. And so the advice I would have is that you need a two-pronged approach. I think that taking a strictly negative or risk avoidance or impact avoidance approach, only the stick, so to speak, when you go address the different constituencies is, I don't want to say it's limited value, but it's only part of the equation. You need to balance that with the carrot. You need to balance that with, if you are able, as an organization to create this right, proper, balanced posture, then you gain competitive advantage in the marketplace, and that means better bonuses, market growth. I mean, whatever is important to whoever your constituency, whoever you're talking to, put it in those terms. And I actually believe it's a very defensible position. I'm again, kind of on record saying that I believe security is going to be, in the very near term here, a source of competitive advantage in the in the enterprise markets, because those organizations that can find that balance, that can be agile enough and adapt to where the market is changing and be able to rapidly spin up partnerships, et cetera, but still do it without having significant security breaches and impacts, are going to be the ones that win the marketplace. And so being able to put those two together, I think, is how you create a lasting impact or a lasting sale, so to speak, to your constituents that you have to get on board with you.
Yeah, I agree, Charles. I think that culturally that it's not something that easily changes, but I think there are definitely ways that security organizations as a whole can become more visible in helping better understand that. And the ways that I really define it is almost like 3 different points. So at the C level, they're all about money and value. And I think you have to articulate to them on a regular basis how you're spending the money and how it's improving your position or making things more secure, including comparing and contrasting to your industry peers. So, people always ask us, how are we doing compared to the other companies in my industry? Or are there ways for me to benchmark? And the answer is absolutely. And you should be looking at doing that, because that's going to give your executives an understanding of how well you're protecting your assets compared to those others. The second area is, looking at the business units. What do they want to know about security? Well, they want to know things that maybe are relevant to them. We actually have some customers who we provide a daily threat report that goes out, which is really more what I would call security headlines that maybe the business units need to be aware of or are going to ask questions on. And we share that out, and they share it out to their business units. Even though they're not security experts, they want to know some things. There's always a common question of, hey, I heard about this latest breach, or this bad threat occurrence occurred, or someone just got shot, which is a physical security concern in a workplace violence issue. You want to send out some awareness of that on a regular basis, and that's a very effective tool that I've seen a lot of companies use at the business unit level to bring some value and keep awareness top of mind. And then the last thing is, the positive reinforcement that Charles was saying. Share successes. So when you successfully block a phishing campaign, or you know that you're not vulnerable to something that has become a public problem for other companies, find ways to promote that and say, hey, here's a great story of how some of our employees helped us catch a phishing campaign that was targeting us, and we shut it down, and we basically were not exposed, right? Or if there's a business email compromise where someone was trying to be socially engineered, and because of the awareness of the team, you all were able to predict that and block it. That's a success story that people start to realize that, I can have an impact and I can be involved in this, and there's positive outcome for me personally in that as well. So I'd say those 3 areas of reports and KPIs for the executives, some daily awareness to the business units, and then some positive reinforcement with success stories that not just are about security wins, but people from the organization who are involved in those wins and pulling them in some manner.
Perfect.
Any other questions?
You, Doug. Yeah. Well, there's a couple more that have come in, but we are very tight on time. I think we'll probably have to address these after the fact. There is one, someone did ask if the slides from today's presentation will be made available, and the answer to that is yes. We will be sending those out after today's webcast with a thank you email, so look for that. There'll be a copy of today's slides as well as a link to download the presentation on demand. So if you happen to join us late, or if you'd like to share this with your colleagues, that will be made available. And these other questions that just came in, we'll go ahead and do these, answer these offline after the webcast. So in closing, I just want to say thank you to both of you, Charles and Doug. Very, very insightful comments. I appreciate you guys being here on today's presentation. And I also want to say thank you to everyone that had joined us for today's live webcast from LookingGlass. And like I mentioned, we will send out a link to the recording. And also the attachments will also be made available via the follow-up email. And then also on this final slide, there's just some ways to get in touch with LookingGlass if you have any additional comments. There's our website. There's also our social media. Feel free to reach out to us if you would like either more questions answered or more in-depth look at the services. But again, thank you so much, Doug and Charles. We appreciate it. Anything else in closing before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thanks. Enjoyed it.
Yep. It was great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Doug. And thanks, everyone else. Have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.